Um, just going by that bio itself, I would like to focus a little on Indo-Lanka relations because that seems to be what I've been working on for a long time. As Kunda often says, I am also a generalist, so I'm no academic, so I also don't have that kind of background, but I did use a couple of researchers to help me with this. And we looked at about 300 samples of mainstream English newspapers just to get a sense as to how we covered certain strategic issues that are very important to India as well as Sri Lanka. In doing so, because I cannot look at a number of years, and in order to make it concise, I looked at the period from 2009 to 2014. That's the 5 years after the war, which is also when some of the foreign policy changes and how we look at the media discourse has changed a lot, and that's what I wanted to look at. But I also want to refer to a small something from my childhood. I remember as a child how the media covered the assassination of Indira Gandhi. And we did not have all the tools, the technology, and lots of television coverage of that. But I remember there was no outright hatred, though I do know Sri Lanka did not enjoy what happened and did not necessarily look at Indira Gandhi at the time in a very positive manner. But during the last 5 years, I just want to highlight a few points as to how Sri Lankan media has largely looked at India and how it has failed to differentiate between Delhi and Tamil Nadu, or how the discourse would be, how the media content will be determined by domestic policies and interests, and our own failure. In a sense, as a journalist who's working on these issues, it's also self-critique. Just to go through a few points. The next one I wanted to highlight was also when there was a rifle assault on Rajiv Gandhi in Colombo way back. I was still a child, but I remember how the media covered, and there was this famous picture where he showed his jaw and said, like, they hit me here. And I recall the Sri Lankan media did not see him in a very friendly manner at that time. But at the same time, there was no spewing out of venom, and there wasn't that kind of critique where journalists felt the need to condemn people, criticize individuals, or foreign policy discussion was so skewed that you looked at individuals, not how countries react, and it's not even incident-based. To save time, I'd just like to read a little bit from the paper, just 5 paragraphs. What changed Sri Lanka perhaps was the victory, the war victory in 2009. And clearly it marks a very strong departure from how we looked at bilateral relations as well as multilateral relations. You can't hear me, sorry. Just put it out. I didn't want to cover the audience. Okay. But it has also made the Sri Lankan government extremely invincible, feel very strong, and this was predicted unwinnable for decades, and there have been Sri Lankan leaders who thought that we could not execute a war to an end, but it has been achieved. And with that achievement, that military victory, has come a sense of achievement, a triumphalism, and euphoria on which he has won elections. The government has won elections. And also how it has also become the government's biggest political strength, justification for some of the anomalies, a convenient tool also to use when dealing with both national as well as external matters. This is really not opinion, my opinion, though I do write opinion. This is something that we gathered through the analysis that the 2 researchers did, looking at content over the past 5 years. To give you a little bit of context, I'll read out from a little report from the International Federation of Journalists, 1 paragraph, just in case for people who may not be very familiar with Sri Lanka, but then I know there are lots of people who are familiar with Sri Lanka here. So it says, the IFJ report of 2014 says, civil liberties continue to be curtailed by the long arm of suppression, and minority rights have become established in Sri Lanka, a country that unrepentantly caters to the interests of the majority community. It has also made Colombo invincible from its standpoint to overlook the need to further devolve power to the periphery through the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, a commitment made to the government of India nearly 3 decades ago. So the war's victory has propped up the government in the eyes of some and made the leadership very resolute. And I know the projection in the Sri Lankan media, and one point I would really like to make is that there's converged media in Sri Lanka. There was room for dissent, and when I was listening to some of the speakers from Afghanistan and Pakistan in the previous session, I almost felt sorry for Sri Lanka, because that alternate viewpoint and that ability to get it across was something that was there in Sri Lanka for a long time. But this has changed since 2009, and systematically so. And what you find is more of the same. Lots of people will put out content, but you will hardly differentiate between the state-owned press or the privately owned media, for that matter. It is in this backdrop that you find media also working very closely with governments. And I can give a case study. I mean, the new organization I represented until last month is one good example, and it's privately owned. So the difference between the state-owned media and the expected role is almost the same role that the private media enterprises seem to be playing in Sri Lanka at present. When we were given the brief to do this paper, there was a very interesting question, as to how policies are being, how involved the defense establishment may be in the policy-making discourse. And it has been documented in Sri Lanka that the foreign policy at times, and I will give you a couple of case studies, gets dictated to by the defense establishment. I mean, when I say dictated to, it is not always. And it happens in different ways, like the creation of space through various websites, for example, government websites, ministry websites, will create space for you, and then you find a whole lot of ghostwriters, embedded journalists who will be putting out content. So what happens in terms is that that intellectual pluralism that media is supposed to be and supposed to represent has been lost in the past few years. And I don't think it is fair only to blame the establishment for what is happening, because media has also been happy to do so for various interests. If you look at business interests, commercial interests, and lots of political interests are also there. So the ownership model has also become very important. We have 3 newspapers owned by parliamentarians, and this is all quite new. And I mean, it sounds amazing because there are some countries with similar experiences, but then even within the region, I know the industry has come a long way and professionalism has been introduced. So if you have that kind of agenda setting, and it becomes easy to dictate terms to, but 2 instances that I would want to refer to would be how Sri Lankan media covered the UNHRC sessions, and how the Sri Lankan media portrayed India and Delhi's political discourse, how it got debated, discussed in the Sri Lankan media, but I'm basically looking at the English newsprint. And the second one is on how Sri Lanka looked at Tamil Nadu and the complex issue of the Tamil question, and how that state's reactions were towards Sri Lanka. But the two instances that I highlighted before about Indira Gandhi's and Rajiv Gandhi's assassinations, I think they seem like so innocent in the way in which that media reported, even if they did not like the particular leadership, given the way in which the venom, the hatred that came out in print with regard to Delhi and Tamil Nadu. And I think there is another speaker who's going to speak about a very famous cartoon about tomorrow, I think, on Jayalalitha Jayaram. We had a cartoon published in one of the mainstream newspapers. The cartoon, I don't even wish to describe it. It was, as a woman also I feel bad, and as a journalist I feel, quite ashamed that this actually made it to print. The chief minister and the Indian Prime Minister was portrayed in such a compromising, negative, crude manner. And there were journalists from India and Sri Lanka. Now that was the nicest thing. These two countries somehow generated two separate statements and a signature campaign that demanded the owners to withdraw that cartoon, which was already published, and it's no longer available. I really wanted to bring it here, but then I can find it, but I didn't really want to show it because it is content withdrawn for very obvious ethical reasons. So that kind of hatred and name calling, the hate speech that has got mainstreamed when it comes to national leaders, and the loss of that nuanced debate being lost. Because I think that's one of the critical points, that we no longer have the nuanced debate about Indo-Lanka relations. Instead, we have a very nationalistic, jingoistic approach, and it's very aggressive in the projection. 1 minute. Oops. Okay. All right. This has also made. I also think, besides being extremely critical of New Delhi and Tamil Nadu, which were not done with academic value, there were instances where not just the ugly cartoons, there were opinions written, and opinion pieces that were highlighted in defense websites, official websites, that would often portray Indian leaders in a very ludicrous, negative manner. And I'm sure Indian foreign policy makers need to rethink how they're going to handle it. But then back at home, Sri Lankans also need to look at it, whether this is this aggressive, negative nature is how you want to go ahead, and plus whether you take media on board to do that jingoistic practice, to take the jingoistic practice forward. And that seems to be a problem that Sri Lanka currently dealing with.